Good evening and welcome to what I know will be a fascinating evening. My name is Jeannette Sanger, and I am a trustee of this wonderful library, founded in 1754, when Samuel Adams was 32. An aimless but congenial man. Many of our founding fathers borrowed books here, including George Washington. But I was disappointed to discover that Samuel Adams did not, as it would have made my introduction more interesting. I was tempted to invent a book, perhaps Moll Flanders. It is a great honor to introduce a longtime library member, Stacy Schiff. She has had so many honors and awards, it is hard to mention them in a brief period of time. The last event I went to for Stacy, the introducer took so long listing each one that there was a very little time for Stacy to speak. I shall try to hit the highlights so you have time to hear Stacy. She won the Pulitzer Prize, and 3 of her books were the New York Times notable books. She has also received fellowships from the Guggenheim and been inducted into the Academy of Arts and Letters, and on and on and on. Tonight, we are celebrating the revolutionary Samuel Adams, which has received ecstatic reviews everywhere and hailed as the best book of the fall. She has brought Samuel Adams out of relative obscurity and into the spotlight he so richly deserves. Stacy Schiff suggests he may have done more than any other founding father to prime colonists for armed rebellion. He was a late bloomer, which always I find encouraging. Who knows what I shall do next? And maybe in 100 years, I'll have a beer named after me. And now let us welcome Stacy Schiff.
Can't just decide what the Jeannette Sanger would taste like, but it sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, it'd be delicious. Very much so. Do you want to talk about the library now, or shall we do it
Do you want to talk about the origins of the book? Is that?
We'll do whatever
Okay.
you want. Okay. Now, Stacy, I'm going to ask you a question you've been asked 1 trillion times, but I promise the rest of my questions will be more interesting.
I'm a Scorpio.
Please let us know what led you to write about Samuel Adams and why, until now, he has been so obscure.
2 things sort of came together, and I'm going to try to answer the question, but I think I may be doing it in a slightly fictional way because the biographer is usually fairly out of touch with her own life. I had just written a book about Salem 1692, which was a very dark 6 years for me. And at the end of that year, at the end of 1692, we have a number of people who very gently, anonymously, and carefully begin to speak up against the witch trials, which was an exceedingly difficult moral stand at that point, because usually to express any kind of skepticism about the trials or witchcraft in general was to invite a witchcraft accusation yourself. So I was thinking a lot about what it took to take that kind of a stand. And it was 2016, so I think, as we all were, I was thinking a lot about the origins of democracy. And for different reasons, I was working with my own previous book, which had been about Ben Franklin's years in France. And Samuel Adams actually makes an appearance in that book very briefly, and to my horror, I realized I knew nothing about him. So here was this person in the pages of my own book, and I was mortified to realize I had no idea really who he was, a mortification that was compounded by the fact that I'm from Adams, Massachusetts. So you'd think I would have had some inkling as to what was going on. Anyway, so those are the 2 sort of currents that came together. But let me just diverge for 1 second, if you'll indulge me, which is to say that there's a point in every writer's life where she basically locks herself in the stacks of the Society Library if she's lucky and says, I'm not coming out until I have a new subject. And that has been my lot in life several times. And at this particular point, it was 2016, I would walk onto the biography, the 7th floor stacks, 9th floor, whatever it is. I'll never get the numbers straight. And I would go to the right, which is where the papers of the person I thought I was writing about were. And then by late morning, I would be sitting on the floor in front of Samuel Adams's published correspondence. And finally, after I'd done this for a number of weeks, my agent said, it seems to me you mean to be writing a book about Samuel Adams. So the genesis of the book, in short, was across the way in the stacks here. And then fast forward 6 years, I was about a year ago in study room 3, I believe, the really super cold one. And I was editing, I had in my hands the first sort of 6 chapters edited by my publisher, who's normally someone I never think of crossing, whose advice I always take. And he actually had taken the first line, I'm so glad you said that about late bloomers, the first line of the book, which was about the fact that Samuel Adams had a remarkable second act, because his first act is one of complete failure. And my beloved editor had said, no, the book doesn't open here. It opens with Thomas Jefferson saying Samuel Adams was the most important man in America in the pre-revolutionary years. That's the obvious way to hook a reader. And I knew that on the other wall was the novelist Ellen Feldman, whom I'm about to embarrass deeply, I hope, who immediately emailed and said, is he right or am I right? And of course she came hustling over to my study room and said, of course you're right. And we had it out right then and there, and so that is the first line of the book, thanks to Ellen and thanks to the Society Library.
Oh, excellent. I
And-
didn't realize the Society Library had so many books on Samuel Adams and all the correspondence. Because when you did your research, as I heard you say, you traveled all around to
A family member published a great deal of the correspondence, but not all. And his papers, the other side of his papers, in other words, the letters to him, as well as many things that were not published for different reasons, are in the New York Public Library. And then the other sort of large swath of material is in the British archives, because that is where Adams, because he's, of course, fomenting rebellion, is not exactly writing down what he's doing, but you can be certain that all of the Crown officials, to whom he is a perfect nuisance, are writing assiduously about what he's doing, and they're writing almost daily back to London saying, here's what this Machiavelli of chaos Samuel Adams is up to. So from the British archives, we have a tremendously detailed account of Adams's activities.
I see. And can you tell us a little bit about his early undistinguished career?
Why do we find it so appealing that he amounts to none? He's from a very wealthy family in Boston. He has the typical education of a well-born Massachusetts boy. He goes to Harvard, he gets a BA, he gets an MA, and he immediately takes a job in an accounting firm, which is run by a friend of his father's, where he proves himself to be spectacularly unsuited to the work at hand, to make a long story short. As his boss puts it, he's a very capable young man, but he has no head for figures because he can think only about politics. And he will then cycle through a few other, he'll manage to squander what remains of the family fortune, he'll cycle through some minor town positions, he will briefly be an extremely indulgent tax collector, which probably enhances his popularity but doesn't help him in terms of his own personal finances. And he'll just sort of shuffle around Boston in these years. He writes for a short-lived newspaper where he proves to be extremely agile with a pen, and then he begins to sort of ghostwrite documents for various members of the Massachusetts House. And that is right at the moment when the Stamp Act becomes the #1 issue in Boston, and he proves to be, for many of them, the most eloquent what shall we say, he's most eloquent in his resistance to the Stamp Act.
So interesting. When I was reading your book, I was struck by how amazing Boston was at that time. I had no idea it was so affluent, and they were wearing livery, and they were so involved with London and getting all the styles and everything from there.
Whenever a wealthy London merchant came to Boston, he was very quick to say that the town was gorgeous, the food was extraordinary. You couldn't get over the price of, how low the prices were. There were oysters at every occasion. You could buy beautiful clothing if only the people were a little bit more docile. was the one objection. But yes, if you read the Boston Gazette for these years, which alas I did to distraction, you can see that there are tremendous numbers of luxury goods for sale in Boston.
But could you tell us a little bit about the land bank fiasco on his father and the Boston economy?
So this is a little hiccup in Massachusetts politics, which has enormous repercussions for later, and which I think probably because it's difficult economically to explain, we tend never to think about. But in short, in 1740, one of the problems in Massachusetts during these years, the colony is in a state of some economic distress, and one of the problems is that there's very little hard currency. So an idea is floated to essentially secure new loans which are secured by land in a land bank directed by 9 men, of which Samuel Adams' father is one of the directors. And the idea really is to issue bonds, currency backed by this land, payable 20 years later, and this will somehow help to revive the economy. The bank takes off. There's immediately an objection to it from the merchant elite in town who don't care for this additional currency, especially since they can't regulate their London debts in this new currency. And the governor, who had initially supported the bank, appeals to London to shut it down as quickly as possible because he puts it, this is going to upend the government in his estimation. It's a fiasco all around. London does, in a very draconian way, a very severe way, shut down the bank, makes all the directors jointly and severally liable for its debts, which ruined Samuel Adams's father. The governor who had originally supported and then obviously undermined the bank is recalled. It increases the collision between, it makes for a collision between the very wealthy in Boston and the less privileged in Boston. And it's really the first time that there's a question about who's in charge in the colonies. Is this imperial overreach, this long arm of London, which is suddenly very kind of abruptly seen in Boston. So it's a sort of hiccup which people will refer to later, like during the Stamp Act crisis, people will say it's almost as bad as the land bank year. It becomes kind of a gauge by which future unrest is measured.
Who was in charge at the time?
Oh, the Crown, London, absolutely. Yeah.
And they didn't really know what was going on over here, did they? Or?
You know, it's such a great question. The level of ignorance on the part of Crown officers and especially of London officials about what is happening in the colonies, where the colonies are, how prosperous the colonies may or may not be, is really mind-boggling, to the point where, Philadelphia was either in the East Indies or the West Indies. Nobody was really certain which. It's just sobering to see how utterly ignorant London is of what its possessions in North America amount to. Very few people had seen the colonies. And there's just a tremendous amount of, it's incuriosity to an nth degree. So that much of this regulation is done without anyone realizing what the repercussions are going to be on the ground.
Yeah, so interesting. So how was this aimless young man able to turn his life around and become such an influential figure? By the time of the Boston Tea Party, Adams was in charge of all the meetings, and you refer to him as the Machiavelli of chaos.
That's Thomas Hutchinson's. That's a Crown officer's expression for him. I know. I wish I'd said that. It's interesting. He's elected to the House of Representatives in the wake of the Stamp Act protests, when his voice for the first time is heard. And as soon as he is elected to the House, both the governor and the lieutenant governor will notice that the Massachusetts House speaks with a different voice, with a much stronger voice, with a more abrupt voice, with a voice that is less accepting of imperial control. As Adams is elected, he and some friends organize a gallery in the Massachusetts House. It's one of their first projects. So that they basically arrange it so that citizens of Boston can now come and occupy the gallery and see their elected officials in action. As Adams puts it, they can now look down upon, the elected officials can look up to their constituents, which is a little bit like installing cameras in Congress. Basically, it's transparency, but it was not something that was well appreciated by the governor or the lieutenant governor in Boston at the time. And that seems to be very indicative to me of the way that Adams makes his presence felt. There's really this sense, as is always the case with him, that government should be responsive to the people, and anything that will facilitate that is worth doing.
And who were some of the friends that he gathered with him when they met in this little group?
I think the most important person to talk about is probably James Otis, who's actually a couple of years younger than Adams, but his mentor insofar as Adams had one. And Otis, who's an extraordinary speaker, an extraordinarily brilliant man, had earlier on argued a case against, which was equally a question of Crown control of the colonies. He'd lost the case, but he'd very much put himself on the map as just a pyrotechnic speaker. He turns out over these years, through the 1760s, to be suffering from some kind of mental illness. And it's interesting because you can see Adams kind of cleaning up after him. Otis is someone who can speak, as John Adams tells us, for hours and hours on end. He can tell us one anecdote. He can make an anecdote last for an entire afternoon. He's endlessly entertaining, but he's also, sucking the oxygen out of the room. And it is Otis who essentially brings Adams into the fold, and who is initially, in the eyes of the Crown officials, the restless incendiary. And by sort of 1768, it is Adams who is the great incendiary, and Adams who's sort of cleaning up after Otis, at whose side he has really learned over those earlier years.
Interesting. We know that Samuel Adams had such influence with his writing and wrote under many pseudonyms. Was it hard for you to distinguish which pseudonym was Adams and which was somebody else?
How many more hours do we have? So and I started this project, I said to Joe Ellis, I'm going to read all the newspapers in Boston for these years. And he said, see you, I'm never going to see you again. There go the next 20 years of your life. So I settled for reading only the Boston Gazettes of these years, which took quite a long time. He was right. And you can see in a lot of cases which pseudonyms were clearly Adams's. So there were a couple of ways to identify them. In the first case, his grandson who had published his papers identifies some of the voices for us. So we know that Vindex and Candidus and a Chatterer and Alfred, we know those were all Samuel Adams. And by the way, I should say why he writes as Alfred, I do not know. We know these pseudonyms to be he, but we don't know why he chooses them. And very often they're chosen for particular reasons. One might be for freedom of speech, one might be against taxes. There are all kinds of different reasons for them. In addition, there had been an earlier Adams biographer, a woman named Cayman And, who had researched a great part of Adams's life and never written a book. And I, fortunately, thanks to her son, had her research materials. Oh. So she had also identified pseudonyms that were Adams's. And then at the heart of this story is an individual whom Bernard Bailyn first wrote about, a hardware store owner in Boston in these years with the delightful name of Harbottle Door. And Harbottle, an excellent name for a cat if anyone is in need of one, Harbottle Door realized in 1765 that history was about to be made, that something was brewing, and began to keep a full collection of Boston newspapers. And on those newspapers, in a kind of crazy quilt of annotation, he would often identify who was behind the pseudonyms. And he would also comment in the margins. He would say, that villain next to Thomas Hutchinson, or, this is my political creed next to Samuel Adams. But he also kind of outed some of Adams's pseudonyms. And then when you read Adams and his letters closely, you begin to see that other articles have lines lifted entirely from his personal correspondence. So I was able to add some more pseudonyms through that. So adding that all up, I'm hitting about 30 pseudonyms, maybe 31. But I'm sure that, ChatGPT could find the rest for me, right? I'm sure there are more there, exactly.
Well, you say this was the golden age of newspapers, and I think you said there were 6 in Boston. How could Boston support so many newspapers?
Yes, you wonder that today, don't you? There were 5 or 6 for all of these years. Boston's a particularly literate town because, of course, Massachusetts was a colony with a very high rate of literacy because to pray you needed to read. So it's always an extremely literate populace. The Boston Gazette outsells all the other papers. It's the one which annoys Crown officers the most because everyone hustles to read it, and it's passed from hand to hand through town. So that was the newspaper really of record, so to speak, in the streets. But there were also opposition newspapers in which Adams, of course, is vilified. And then there are newspapers that kind of are more short-lived. But for most of this time, there are 5 or 6 papers.
Yeah. Amazing.
And the beauty, I should say, of all those papers and all of those pseudonyms is that it has the effect of making resistance seem more general than it would be if one person were constantly writing under his own name. Their whole army, this legion of masked objectors, all of them happen to be Samuel Adams.
So interesting. Well, John Adams said 1765 was the most remarkable year of his life. The Stamp Act arrived amidst much dissension and violent riots. What was Samuel Adams' response to the Stamp Act?
There is an enormous amount of street violence that year, and obviously, since Harbottle Door also notices it, everyone realized this, that there is a great convulsion that year, that something is about to change in some way. I mean, the question of independence or separation is far off, nowhere on the stage at this point. Adams' response that year is to write essentially the first salvo against imperial authority on behalf of the Massachusetts House, which he hasn't yet entered. In fact, he writes it, he edits it or writes it, we don't really know exactly which, before he's yet elected. And in the street protests, we have no sense of his role. Thomas Hutchinson's house that year is famously destroyed, it's pillaged, everything is thrown from the windows because it is falsely understood that poor Thomas Hutchinson, then lieutenant governor, had endorsed the Stamp Act, when in fact he had objected to it insofar as he could as a Crown official at the time. But his house is pillaged by a mob. Other Crown officers are equally either bullied or threatened. There's a lot of street violence. There are effigies hung in the streets. We don't know where Adams is in any of that, except that it's largely the work of the Sons of Liberty, an organization to which he only loosely belongs. And we know that when Thomas Hutchinson, after the destruction of his home, will appeal to the Massachusetts House to be reimbursed for his losses, Adams does everything he can to see to it that Thomas Hutchinson is not reimbursed. So.
Interesting. Evidently, he listed every single thing that he lost, including his livery for his servant.
I feel like there's a doctoral thesis waiting to be written about this. It's an 18-page inventory of what was in Hutchinson's house. A mob comes in with axes. They tromp up to the third floor and down. They throw beds and pillows out the windows. Thomas Hutchinson's papers, which today still have mud on them, are in the streets. But Hutchinson, to be reimbursed, lists everything: his telescope, his council robe, his servants, his children's riding clothes. Everything is listed, and it's fascinating because there are a lot of dishes. You can see precisely what was in one of the wealthiest homes in the colonies, actually, at the time.
So interesting. Well, evidently, the Stamp Act electrified the country and caused many protests, and I can't resist a rather prurient question. You say that female patriots refused to populate the colonies. How did you discover this? And does it mean that women refused to sleep with their husbands until the act was repealed? It reminds me of Lysistrata. And how did the husbands feel?
It's the short-lived American Lysistrata, exactly. It's from a Connecticut newspaper, is how I found it. And that's all I know about it, and I'm sure it did not amount to very much. Right.
But caught my interest.
Given the birth rate in the colonies, exactly.
He was a delegate to the Continental Congress in 1776 in Philadelphia. Why wasn't he a delegate to the Constitutional Convention?
So what happens to Adams after the Revolution is really interesting, and this comes down to how many acts there are in the life, in a way, because there's this obviously very unsatisfactory first act, and then there are these dazzling dozen years, really until the end of the war, and then Adams really falls off the stage. And there are a number of things. First of all, he's older than many of the other representatives. In fact, he's now a man in his 60s with somewhat frail health, but he seems to have been by nature someone who preferred to dissent, and someone who preferred the obstacle, and someone who preferred to tear things down rather than build things up. He's not a federalist. He's not completely committed to this idea that the states should not be sovereign unto themselves. And he doesn't see eye to eye with this whole, he's really sort of harking back after the Revolution to a very pure and simple past rather than the opulent commercial capitalistic future. So he's really out of sync with the country he has helped to create. Actually, it's a French emissary to Philadelphia will say of Adams that he guesses that when all of this is over, Adams will sink into insignificance. And that's pretty much what happens. He really does kind of just fall off the stage. And he has the kind of mortifying experience of reading the first histories of the Revolution. So he reads of his own participation in the Revolution, and of course discovers things that never really happened. So he reads, for example, that he had opposed George Washington, which he never had, which is said of him because of his enemies in the first history of the Revolution. So he's really sort of outlived his usefulness in many ways, and has very mixed feelings about the Constitution as it is originally proposed.
So what was the most surprising thing that you learned? I mean, just that he became so obscure, or there were untrue things written about him, or was there one particular thing that struck you?
That's such a great question. I think two things, really. One is the completeness with which he disappears, because if you do read his contemporaries, every single one of them makes it clear, makes his primacy clear. And that was part of the driving force of writing the book of, well, if Thomas Jefferson says this and John Adams says this, how did this man go missing? What did they know that we didn't know? And John very clearly says, this is the revolution that precedes the revolution is the work of Samuel Adams. And that is the real sort of turning point here. So part of that is, I would say, is in answer to your question, I think the most surprising thing is that if and when we think of Adams, I think we generally write him off as a firebrand or sort of a Boston radical. And if you read the contemporary accounts, and in particular John Adams, you read about this man of immense erudition, of very affable demeanor, of exquisite humanity, as John Adams says of him. He's a very decorous, very affable, very gentle soul, very sweet soul. He's not at all this raging firebrand of our imaginations. But he does have this sort of preternatural ability to just kind of take ambient ideas from the air and pin them to the page, so that by the time you get to Thomas Jefferson listing all of these injuries and usurpations on the part of the crown, those were all things that Adams had already identified in the previous 12 years.
Well, he was really a man of ideals, and a kind of appealing that he went around looking like a slob and didn't care about material things. You described the portrait.
We have the same taste in men, obviously, yeah. I mean, there's a wonderful moment when Adams is about to attend the First Continental Congress, and he's a man of, he's penniless for most of these years. He lives off the charity of friends and probably largely off the charity of John Hancock. And Adams is about to go to Philadelphia. It's the first time he will ever have left the colony of Massachusetts. And clearly, Boston is not happy to find themselves represented by someone who is as ill-dressed as Samuel Adams. And so to his home come in sort of fairy tale succession one night, anonymously, a very fine tailor and a very fine cobbler and a very fine wig maker. And a week later, what arrives at the doorstep but an entire trunk with a new wardrobe for Samuel Adams, with which to make his way to the First Continental Congress, which tells you a lot about how much beloved he is, in fact, in Boston, and how ill-dressed he was.
Now, you're always so busy reading, researching, writing. What do you like to read for fun?
I really live completely on fiction. So if I'm not reading a good novel, I'm pretty sure I don't exist at that moment.
And what was the last great novel that you read?
Oh, Ellen, may I please embarrass you again? Ellen Feldman's forthcoming novel.
Oh.
And before that, Hartley's The Go-Between, which I had somehow never read. Has everybody read this novel except me? The novel that begins "The past is a foreign country." We all use that line. I've never read the book. It's so delicious.
Oh, well,
it
that's
feels like
good to
early
know.
Ian McEwan. That's what it feels.
Oh, how
Yeah, it's
fabulous!
really delicious.
How fabulous! Have you ever thought about writing fiction yourself? Because your writing is so lyrical. As I read some of the sentences, I just wanted to read them over and over because your writing is so beautiful.
Thank you. I thought about it, and then I decided I shouldn't. But I do think, I mean, after a long day of reading Boston Gazettes or 18th century 18th century handwriting, I have thought fiction might be a fine idea. I will admit, and I do feel like that is part of the problem with with any research before the age of the typewriter, is that you are really up against documents which are, in many cases, obviously, or at least a research trail which is in many cases shoddy, from which things are missing, but also one in which things are often illegible. There's one Samuel Adams letter which is really important to someone who had actually backed him in his early years, whose family he then ends up opposing, and there's one piece of the letter that's cut out, and of course it's the only 3 words you want in the letter. And it just seems to me that is research in a nutshell.
Yes, yes. Well, could you please close our conversation before we open it by reading Thomas Jefferson's tribute to Samuel Adams?
I'd love to, but we have a copy of the book. So,
Here it comes.
Thank you. Thank you. So in terms of political philosophy, I think it's pretty fair to say that Jefferson comes closest to Adams. John Adams and Samuel Adams will later in life, I'm just chattering while I try to find the page, will later in life pretty much part ways, but Jefferson and Adams always see eye to eye. And this is Jefferson writing to Adams in 1800. When in 1800, Thomas Jefferson resumed a correspondence with Adams, the two had not seen each other for years. Since, as Jefferson had it, the anxious days we then passed in struggling for the cause of mankind. The storm was over. They were, each congratulated the other, in port. Your principles have been tested in the crucible of time and have come out pure, Jefferson assured his colleague 32 years after Adams had ventured to suggest that we fight more ardently for our liberty than for all else. He felt more affection for Adams than for any other patriot. At the end of the year, after the ugliest of elections, Jefferson defeated John Adams to become the 3rd president of the United States. For the first time in American history, one political party prepared to hand power to another. In his inaugural address, Jefferson aimed at reconciliation. It was time to banish intolerance and come together with one heart and one mind. America remained, he argued, the world's best hope. Its government was the only one where every man, at the call of the law, would fly to the standard of the law and would meet invasions of the public order as his own personal concern. Differences of opinion should not be construed as differences of principle. No one would have guessed that Samuel Adams, that old Machiavelli of chaos, stood behind those honeyed words, but there he was. Though delivered to the people of the United States, Jefferson addressed his remarks directly to his venerable colleague. The new president had done his best, he confided, to channel him. Adams should read the address as a private letter. Is this exactly in the spirit of the patriarch of liberty, Samuel Adams? Jefferson had asked himself again and again. Is it as he would express it? Will he approve of it? Jefferson reached for the essence of republicanism, toward a pure expression of the founding ideals. He hoped he might also solicit the counsel of the man that he considered the earliest, most active, and most persevering of the Revolution. Adams brushed off the compliments. Indeed, they had survived a mighty storm. It would be some time before prejudice receded and men returned to their senses. He too looked forward to a restoration of harmony, to the triumphs of truth and virtue. As for Jefferson's request for guidance, he demurred. Old men deluded themselves when they dredged up lessons from a past they only dimly remembered. He could volunteer no advice. Samuel Adams offered his blessing.
Thank you, Stacy. That's so beautiful. Wonderful. And now we'd like to open the floor to questions. Alex, you should use it.
Always.
Alex.
I'm reading in your book, you describe Adams as a pious man, a congregationalist, observant. And when he became his governor, at the time our Constitution had a First Amendment prohibiting the establishment of religion, and Massachusetts permitted towns to tax their citizens to pay for churches. And he did nothing about that. Can you talk about his faith and his differences with Jefferson on that?
Yeah, and we don't know that much. It's really interesting you ask about Jefferson. We don't know that much about what goes on between the two of them. Adams is deeply pious from the outset, and all of his ideas about republicanism, about government, which is, egalitarian and community-minded and non-hierarchical, fall out of his ideas, fall out of his Puritanism, fall out of his faith. He apparently proceeded always by religious allegory and often was quoting scripture. He often quotes scripture in his letters. It's there throughout. As I say in the book, it's like the watermark that shines through everything that he writes. He's the one who, when Congress first meets and has this immediate collision about whether they should open with a prayer or not, the first meeting of the First Continental Congress, and someone objects that they can't possibly open with a prayer because they have Quakers and Baptists and Presbyterians, and how are they going to come up with a common prayer? It's Adams who, in a masterful political stroke, suggests that they just invite the Episcopalian minister because he's apparently wonderful, and if he, a dogged Puritan, can listen to this man, surely everyone else could too. So there's the sense of his making the ecumenical gesture. On the other hand, when he's, for example, relitigating the Boston Massacre results, and he's essentially casting aspersions left and right on everyone involved in the massacre, he's very happy to write off one of the witnesses to what had happened as someone who no one should believe because, God forbid, the man was a Roman Catholic. So you see both sides here very clearly. I think there are a tremendous number of contradictions in his later years between what he believes and what we actually see on the record. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that he's misrepresented a lot of the time. He has a lot of enemies after the war, largely thanks to John Hancock, which is a whole other story. But because of that, there's a lot said about Adams, which is patently false, and he never really makes an effort to correct the record. Am I calling or are you calling?
John Adams once wrote, quote, "The common herd of mankind." What was Samuel Adams' social attitude toward the hoi polloi?
That's a great question. Samuel Adams is so distinctly and from the outset a man of the people. And that you can see that with the effort to build a gallery. If there's one thing he stands against, it is essentially the entrenched elite of Boston. And from the beginning, there is this disdain for what he calls the odious hereditary distinction of families. He feels, I mean, if he has a political philosophy, is essentially that the government should have very little and the people a great deal, and that wealth and privilege should step aside and make room for genius and industry. And there is this constant harping on not just virtue, but on education as the means by which that is created, at the sense that opportunity should be available across the board. And whenever he talks about this, by the way, he always says boys and girls should have equal access to education. And that he gets into an interesting tussle later with John Adams about this for very much the reason you mentioned, because Samuel Adams is of the opinion that there is indeed an aristocracy, but it's an aristocracy of achievement. It's not an inborn aristocracy of any kind. And he very much opposes any kind of institution that closes its doors to opportunity. So very much always the champion of the common man, which is where he and Jefferson end up on the same side.
Thank you.
In the middle here?
Hi. I'm just wondering, when you wrote this book and when you wrote it, how do you know you have enough for a book? So, I mean, what sorts of things would have to go missing for you to say, I have to walk away? For example, if you hadn't been able to find pseudonyms, or some other critical piece of information where things are just so thin.
Yeah.
And you can't, so I'd love to hear about that.
It's such a great question. And in the middle of the night, the answer is that happens every single time. Just, between 3 and 5 a.m., that's true of every book I've ever written, just to be perfectly clear. I will say that Samuel Adams had a lot going for him because he wasn't Cleopatra. So in terms of an historical record, I was swimming in material for this book, even though I didn't have the things I really needed. And I think that has probably encouraged me to take a greater risk on someone who had less of an archive, because I feel like I literally wrote about someone for whom there is no archive. So everything feels like a godsend. And when I was working on Cleopatra, I would console myself that, and that was a really rocky 5 years, let me just be perfectly clear. I would console myself that this was a little bit better than Jane Austen, but at least it was better than, there's a Jack Miles biography of God. And I thought, well, at least I have more to go on than he did. So that was how I would kind of stay safe. But I essentially have approached both that book and this one in a similar way, which was thinking it maybe can't be a traditional biography. It ended up being largely a traditional, I think, biography, but that I could do it in 5 scenes or 6 scenes. And I remember writing early on, I wrote a little list of, I knew where Adams was for the Boston Tea Party, which we didn't talk about. I knew where Adams was for the Boston Massacre. I could perhaps tell the life in, 5 moments. And if I could do that, that was kind of a cheap way of, working around where the material isn't. And then the more I researched, in both cases, both this and Cleopatra, the more I realized that you really could tell a full-scale life in a fairly traditional way. And some of that is just realizing that when you don't have what you need, you have to use something else. And the best example I can give for that is with Cleopatra, we have, as with all figures of antiquity, no childhood. But we know what she read, and we know precisely what she read, because what she read was what any well-born person in the Hellenistic world would have read. And we know in what order she read it and how she read it, who read it to her. And so I could substitute her education for her childhood, and then just hope the reader didn't notice.
You said that Samuel and John Adams parted ways. It always seemed to me that John Adams, who came from a poorer branch of the family, was a man on the make, while, as you described Samuel, it was very much downwardly mobile, enhanced by his own sympathies for the downward trajectory. So when and where what made them part?
It's such an interesting relationship. So just to go back a half step, it's Samuel who recruits John, who's 11 years younger. You see how quickly one forgets these things. And I think we have that reversed because John has so much eclipsed Samuel. I think we think of him as, the more important Adams in some ways. So Samuel is older. He's the urbane older cousin who basically brings John, a country bumpkin, into the fold, as he does other young men in Boston whom he recruits to the cause. And when John first meets Samuel, which is in the early 1760s, two things are clear. One, he's starstruck by his older cousin, which is interesting from our vantage point because it so much seems the opposite. And the two of them very early on agree, we don't know the reason for this, that Thomas Hutchinson is the greatest threat to American liberty of any man alive. It's no one in England, it's Thomas Hutchinson. So they already have this distaste, this contempt in common, which has nothing, and they will turn Hutchinson into the villain of the piece, but they're not even looking at Great Britain. They're looking at essentially this paragon of the elite aristocracy in Boston, and realizing that they approach it with the same disdain and despair. They work very much in concert, Samuel very often asking John to help out from a legal point of view. And then slowly, of course, as in the course of the Continental Congresses and in the years of the Revolution, John will eclipse Samuel, so that when John is sent to France to essentially bother Benjamin Franklin, but really raise money for the Revolution, everyone will think he's Samuel Adams, and they'll say, "Oh my goodness, Mr. Adams," and he'll say, "No, you're thinking of a different man," and they think he's just being modest, which obviously John Adams couldn't be, so that's not true. So he'll say, "No, you're thinking of," he's still the lesser Adams at this point. And then obviously slowly as Sam recedes, and they begin to discuss between the two of them the future of America, you see John very much a man in touch with what the country is becoming, a man who believes in and helps to design institutions, and Samuel is still preaching his old, he's still singing the song about virtue and the common man basically having opportunity. There's an exchange of letters between the two of them in 1790, which is really kind of incredibly moving because it's Samuel saying, "I don't believe in any kind of aristocracy. I don't believe in any kind of inherited privilege." And here you see John Adams, on the verge of one president on the verge of being the father of another president. You see him standing for a completely different America. And they're very much at odds at this point. And by the time Samuel dies, John is despairing of how parochial his cousin was, how stubborn he was, how mulish he is. And writes, the last thing he writes about him is a note saying that he hopes he won't end up, Samuel Adams was clearly a little bit senile in his last years. He hopes he won't end up as this pathetic figure, sort of a weight to everyone around him who really is no longer in possession of his faculties. It's a really kind of horrible letter.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I wonder if you knew, you're probably asked this a lot, what your next biographical subject will be, and if it was in any way influenced by the current book.
I thought we were going to come up with that idea here tonight in this room. That's why I came. I don't, and insofar, this book really did in many ways fall out of the witchcraft book, The Witches. And I don't necessarily see another book falling out here. To some extent, I think I was thinking that this book was kind of a way that how do you get from benighted 17th century Salem to the world of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson? The answer is through these years and through Samuel Adams. And so in a funny way, I felt I was filling in, I was connecting the two books. There was a sort of very loose trilogy in my mind there. And I feel like now I want to kind of go somewhere else, but I know I don't want to write about a Hellenistic sovereign, and I probably don't want to write about Alfred Hitchcock's wife. So those are the only two things I'm looking at. But I'm open to all ideas, Ellen, so feel free.
Question? Yeah. How would you describe democracy in period issue?
Well, democracy, interestingly, is not a word that anyone uses at this point. So what Adams would have said was the perfect organization of a government was essentially a government in which everyone is represented, but government corrects for the whims and caprices of the people. So in other words, doesn't allow turbulent passions to unseat duly elected individuals. For example, he will draw a distinction between the Stamp Act protests and that kind of violence, or any of the violence in the years leading up to the Revolution, and the violence that will occur later during Shays' Rebellion, when there is resistance to a properly elected government. And that's what he meant by the caprices and the whims. So to keep somehow the tumult of the people under control, but to have as wide a base, a wide a subscription base as you can possibly have to government. How to institutionalize that is something he never addressed. And that's where John and he, in many ways, are very different, because John is thinking about that. John is thinking very actively about the architecture of a republic, And Samuel Adams is really just stuck in this idea that all voices should feel heard and that the government should be responsive to the people in a way that prior to the revolution, it had distinctly not been.
Was there a relationship between Hamilton and Sam Adams?
It seems to be the question of the moment. There's almost nothing that we know between the two of them. Part of the problem here is that the papers for the congresses are very scant because, of course, everyone is sworn to secrecy. And the age difference is immense there as well. So I don't know of any real relationship between the two.
Yeah, it seems to, what I found quite interesting, and I really enjoyed the book, is you seem to describe a man who is the right person for the right moment that allowed him to actually express his capacities. If he hadn't had that opportunity, he may not have been able to. And on the other side, if America hadn't had someone with those capacities, we might have been in a different place. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
I think that's beautifully said, and I couldn't have said that better myself. I mean, it is one of those things of it's a perfect fit until it isn't anymore, right? It's not. Is it that his gifts desert him, or is it that the moment is over? And for that moment to have had someone who was dogged doesn't even begin to describe it, who had such utter resolution about the fact that he was right and this was the way the world was going to go at a time when everyone else falls off. I mean, every other member of the opposition essentially decides after the Boston Massacre, it can go quiet. It's just not, everyone just wants to go back to life as they knew it.
Right.
Adams is the sole holdout at that point, right? So you see that dogged determination at that point and the eloquence to be able to actually articulate something that no one is yet thinking. So there's a real prescience there in his writing and a beauty in the writing, I might add, that and as we know, there's a lot of writing. So there's this tirelessness to the whole enterprise that really just gets into the groundwater. And would that have happened without Adams? Absolutely, those ideas were in the air. But that it happens as quickly as it does, and as pointedly as it does, to my mind, would never have happened without Adams. I mean, there's such clear cause and effect. I mean, even when you read Harbottle Door's newspaper collection, you see what a man in the street was thinking as he's reading these pages. And it really, your chills go up your spine because you really see how someone is taking in these new ideas. And that's a really formidable enterprise, it seems to me.
I'll throw in one from over here, if you don't mind. Would you like to talk about the Boston Tea Party, or if that's too broad, would you like to maybe disabuse us of some myth or legend that we picked up about it that's actually incorrect?
Sure. Well, I guess for starters, it wasn't a tea party until the next century. It's always the destruction of the tea, which obviously it was. Essentially, where do we want to start? Tea arrives in Boston. To accept the tea, as the colonists see it, is to accept parliamentary sovereignty. The tea, therefore, must not be landed. All attempts to turn the boats around are denied. And this is largely Thomas Hutchinson just being obdurate, partly possibly because he had already given in to Adams on a previous occasion. So we are stuck with this tea in Boston Harbor. It can't be returned to London, but nor can it be unloaded. So therefore, ergo, it must be destroyed. That is the work of a great number of people over the course of a great number of public meetings. At the end of the last of these, most of Boston traipses down to the wharf and watches 30 or 40 people lightly disguised as Indians, although they're not Indians till later either, pull the crates up from the holds, chop them apart with tomahawks or axes, and then toss both tea and wood into the harbor. What's fascinating is that there were somewhere between 2,000 and 7,000 people on the wharf that night in Boston, but no one had seen a thing. So the next day when people are, and then over the next weeks when poor dear beleaguered Thomas Hutchinson is attempting to get an account of who was involved and how this could have happened, because it's nothing he ever had considered possibly happening, he's able to pick up no clues whatsoever. From depositions that are taken a few months later in London, 12 individuals who were there that night are deposed in London, and because they're an ocean away, they feel that it is safe for them to divulge what they know. And in each of those accounts, Samuel Adams was if not the prime mover at the meetings, then the person who sort of appointed who was going to speak next and who spoke very vocally in these meetings about what needed to happen. As he says at the outset that week, he doesn't trust to the private virtue of his fellow citizens to not drink the tea, so he would prefer to trust to their public virtue in rejecting the tea. And he's quoted over and over in various accounts over those couple of days. Thomas Hutchinson will say of Adams the next morning that he had never seen Adams in greater glory than he was the morning after the Tea Party. And Adams had written beforehand that he suspected that he would soon be writing a correspondent in London of a non-trifling event, which does kind of sound like the destruction of the tea. It is an event that he says takes place with decency, unanimity, and spirit, even though it is the destruction of private property. But that is how he's trying to spin it, and that's how obviously the Patriot cause are trying to spin this thing. It's a noble defense of virtues rather than a lawless destruction of property. And it's a hard sell initially because not everyone is of the same mind at this point. So I guess there are a lot of myths around the Boston Tea Party. The people who are at the wharf that night who actually destroy the tea have their faces blacked and they're sort of wearing a crazy collection of, they look like they've come from a costume drama basically, old clothes. But they're not initially identified as Indians. And then slowly over the next weeks, people start saying Mohawks, Indians, no one really gets the same tribe, but the idea simply is we're not going to name names, so we're just going to sort of write them off as, as Native Americans in some way, and we'll let that fiction live. And only of course 2 generations later is it the Boston Tea Party. I mean, only much later is it the Boston Tea Party, and only 2 generations later is it that everyone in Boston participated in the Boston Tea Party.
Hi. I'm curious, did Adams ever express a view about the Indians, so to speak, and their role in this emerging country?
So at the point where Adams spends an enormous amount of time, and I didn't talk about, is trying to pull the colonies together. And in fact, wires the colonies ultimately for revolution in a way that proves immensely effective and is arguably his greatest achievement. In trying to do that, he also reaches out to many of the Indian communities to see if they will help join in resisting the British. Because as he puts it, if they're going to come to cut our throats, they're going to cut your throats too. And he writes a couple of letters to that effect, for which I don't believe ever got answers, but he definitely sees the Native Americans as being part of this community who are under assault from the British. Yes.
Maybe one more question?
So after, building on that question, after meeting the moment, being the person of history who was right for that moment, and is there any, and then receding after that, is there any indication that he felt any regret personally about receding afterwards, or was he perfectly happy to basically go back to his pious life of integrity which he had before?
There are always a couple of questions you wish you could ask your biographical subject. And, one of them are those 2 words from that letter that I can't read. And another one of them is, how much did you have to do with the Boston Tea Party? And that might be the third. There is no expression of regret whatsoever. There are a lot of missed opportunities. I mean, John Adams several times and very specifically says to Samuel, you can't leave the history to other people here. You have to write up what happened. And you must, if nothing else, collect your papers, because your papers over those decades are something everyone's going to want to read. They're going to be read throughout the world. You owe it to everyone to collect them. And Adams never does it. So there does seem to be this kind of just, it's inexplicable to me, but there does seem to be this just relinquishing of the role, or at least relinquishing of, he's a very modest man, I should probably stress that, this relinquishing of the spotlight. He never liked to be in the spotlight. He didn't really ever like to claim credit for everything. He always worked by committee and behind the scenes. And there seems to have been just a sort of willingness to sit back at that moment. There does not seem to be a lot of political ambition in those years, and he makes for a terrible Massachusetts governor. So it is, and again, there it's hard to separate, is that ambition, or is that his health is so frail that he's really floundering at that point, because he does outlive himself.
Stacy, Schiff, and Jeannette Watson-Sanger, thank you so much.